Good morning. Welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Aparna Pande. I direct the India program at Hudson. As 2025 approaches and the new US presidential administration in a few months will need to define and implement a new approach to the world's two most populous nations, India and China, who are also nuclear-armed neighbors and two of the fastest growing economies. In the backdrop of deepening US-China peer competition and rivalry, India's rise as an economic and security partner who shares similar values presents opportunities for American grand strategy. Understanding the relationship, the rivalry between Asia's two largest nations will also be crucial as we enter the new year. To discuss this, we are fortunate to have with us today an excellent panel. Dr. Jonathan Ward is my colleague at Hudson and the author of the Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. Dr. Daniel Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. We will start the conversation with initial remarks by both Jonathan and Dan, and then move into a moderated conversation. Jonathan?
Sure. Thank you, and good morning, and thanks for coming out to Hudson on a foggy Friday morning. It's good to see you all. So today, I think, as we head into the middle of the 2020s, which at this point many see as the pivotal moment in sort of American grand strategy, US-China relations, where are we going in the bigger picture? As Aparna mentioned here, the question of the two most populous nations in Asia, one of whom is a dedicated US adversary, the People's Republic of China, and the other which represents potentially a tremendous opportunity for the US, for our allies, for the broader free world to, I think, ultimately prevail in strategic competition with our authoritarian adversaries. How do we handle that bigger picture? What is the nature of the relationship between these two countries? What sort of direction are we going here as we head into 2025, which on one hand means that there's real maturity to Chinese grand strategy, the real maturing of the India sort of economic story and economic potential, and then a pivotal moment in America with the advent of a new administration and potential changes in American strategy towards certainly China, but potentially both nations. So just to talk a little bit about where we're going here, I mean, the first thing on the China side is, as we've seen over the past 5 or even getting on 8 years now, a change from the era of engagement with China into an era of competition, and I think that's about to go much, much harder. In fact, the US is just beginning to respond to the real nature of the PRC threat. I mean, things that go well beyond Chinese grand strategy with the Belt and Road military buildup, Made in China 2025, various industrial strategies, all of which challenge us economically, diplomatically, militarily. And there's also the assault on the US through fentanyl. There's now been real evidence given in the American Congress about PRC support for that, and that has now killed nearly 500,000 Americans. So I think we're headed into a much more confrontational phase with China, and rightly so. I mean, we're going to have to, I think, take this issue on in tougher ways. Much of what I've advocated in my own work has to do with economic approaches to China, which I've called economic containment, the opportunity to really terminate the geopolitical rise of the People's Republic of China, which has always relied on access to American and allied markets, technology, and capital. If we're able to cut those things off and start doing that across a wider band of sectors and industries, as opposed to sort of high-tech focus, I think we can really, put a stop to the general rise, do away with their ability to fund and finance outbound grand strategy, and begin to rebuild and restructure the world economy in an ex-China, post-China moment. And within that picture, of course, you have the question of India, which is now the world's 5th largest economy. It's headed to 3rd largest. It's the fastest growing major economy. It presents, I think you're starting to see a lot of real optimism and curiosity about India in the business sector, which was less true, let's say, 5 years ago. Now you're seeing that in the finance sector, in private equity, in general markets. I mean, it's different from the traditional sort of technology focus and sort of services sector focuses that we've seen over the last 10 years or so. So the U.S.-India relationship, as we know, is pretty well developed now with a strong defense trade, with the potential of India as a counterweight to the rise of China. I mean, that's pretty established in US strategic thinking. And then the fact that these two nations, despite recent disengagement agreements on the border, still have a relationship that's characterized by real danger, hostility, recent violence on the border, and the legacy of the 1962 China-India border war, which, as someone whose PhD was on that subject and on the Chinese sort of view of war with India in '62, I mean, that was really the defining moment, I think, in modern Indian foreign policy, where they shifted from the idea of engagement with all sorts of nations and, hoping for the best to a much more strategic and realpolitik approach, certainly to their neighbor in China. So that's going to, I think some of these fundamentals are really going to allow the US-India strategic relationship to continue to flourish. We're going to have to, in my view, get as focused as we can on the economic side. The old idea of Mission 500 in Washington, how do you get US-India trade up to 500 billion? That's something that, ideally we achieve that in the 2020s. And we're about 200 billion now. There's still a lot of room to move in US-India trade, and particularly as we restructure the international trading system to, get to a point where China's playing less of the role that it plays now. That's creating new opportunities for American businesses and others who are looking for supply chain diversification. So there's still a lot that India will have to do to help facilitate that. But I think the appetite is not only real, but it's necessary. And these will be driven by the fundamental restructuring of the post-China world economy and the fact that US grand strategy has to, we still have to win the economic competition in terms of trade, high-tech, strategic industries, capital markets, and our general position as the centerpiece of the world economy. And we can establish that, I think, very firmly for the decades ahead if we execute a strategy of economic containment with China. And then finding other markets where American businesses can thrive, where we can rebuild and restructure that general picture. India could be a pretty vital centerpiece to that, partially because it's also able to engage with the emerging markets in a way that is slightly different and advantageous in comparison to OECD and treaty allies of America. So all that to be said, I mean, we'll get into a broader and deeper conversation today, but the big picture is essentially, as we head into the post-China moment, we have have to take a very renewed focus on India. That could be a big piece of how we ultimately succeed.
Thanks, Jonathan. Dan,
Great.
I'm hoping you will disagree a bit with Jonathan and be the skeptic in the room.
Well, we'll see about that. But first, thanks to both of you. It's a great opportunity to be here at Hudson. Jonathan's already given a nice overview, I think, in terms of where we are in pieces of the US-China relationship and how India kind of fits into that. And I want to kind of bring the aperture or bring it down a little bit to kind of a little bit of a look back at what the Biden administration has done and a little bit of a look ahead into the Trump administration. We talk a lot, and I think rightly, about policy continuity in US attitudes toward India over now at least 2 decades. And that's right. But I would say the Biden administration put a surprising emphasis on India, in my view, from the get-go. And there was a sense that, you might say, winning India and keeping India on side in ways that would be helpful to the United States in our competition with China wasn't just a kind of a nice to have, but was urgent, was an imperative. This was an administration that was really zealous in its pursuit of a closer relationship with India, often to its credit. And we saw that from the beginning. I mean, right out of the gate, picked up where the Trump administration had been on the Quad, had a virtual Quad summit. We saw it all the way through, including with some highlights like Modi's state visit and sort of the rolling out literally of the red carpet for that. High-level initiatives, including ISET, which brought national security advisors together to talk about critical and emerging technologies, a willingness by the White House and then a force by the White House onto other parts of the US government to, in some ways, break crockery, to break bureaucratic rules and get stuff done on things like a decision to go ahead with a deal on GE jet engine co-production in India. and even a clear motivation by this administration to keep the differences that we continued to have with India or that cropped up along the way, like this Pande case, and more recently, issues like Bangladesh, this Adani issue that's just come up, to keep those things as much as possible under the carpet or behind closed doors or however you want to put it, but keep them diplomatically contained. And so now, I think, now looking back at nearly 4 years, it is hard for me to imagine, some partisan sniping aside and some sort of little jabs here and there by New Delhi, hard to imagine that Washington could have been more forthcoming over the past 4 years than this administration was. And all of that took place at an unusual time in the India-China relationship. You saw this dispute over Galwan in 2020, a sharp downturn in the India-China bilateral, and China doing nothing to make India comfortable, right? Nothing along the border to make India comfortable, but also nothing in India's neighborhood, nothing globally. Wolf Warrior was alive, COVID, and so on. Nothing in the South China Sea. Closer ties with Russia, India's longtime supplier of military capabilities, all make India nervous. And so arguably you could say the past 4 years, 5 years or so has been a unique opportunity for Washington to lock in our relationship with India in ways that I think this administration tried to do. Okay, that's looking back. Now quickly looking ahead. The question for the next year and the next 4 years really is whether that particular convergence of eagerness on the part of Washington and India's concerns about China will persist. And my best guess is that we're going to see at least some kind of a shift in terms of Washington's strategic logic and policy emphasis, but that the broad attraction of the US-India relationship and the broad concerns about China will persist. So Trump's focus on trade and tariffs, concerns about jobs and American workers, less so Indian workers and Indian jobs, may shift the willingness of co-production arrangements will sound far less attractive, I think, to a Trump administration than they might have been palatable to a Biden administration. But still, higher tariff barriers to Chinese goods will continue to create opportunities for India to fill certain gaps. There's a clear enthusiasm in the incoming Trump team, as far as we can tell, Waltz, Rubio, and so on, for India. And so we can expect kind of a lot of positive rhetoric at the very least, and diplomacy and open doors, and a desire to make deals with India. There's going to be a lot of deal making or a desire to do that moving forward. So expect things like ISET, this initiative on critical and emerging technologies, maybe under a different name, to persist and to be maybe driven by others within the administration going forward. Now, on the Indian side, we have seen a bit of a recalibration in relations with Beijing just over the past few months. This border arrangement that Jonathan alluded to is not a huge deal, but it's a deal of sorts. And so what I think we're seeing on both India's side and the Chinese side is a sense that there are diminishing rewards to heightened tensions along that border. There were costs to continuing that kind of tense standoff. And so they can push that issue more to the background and bring other issues more to the foreground. But in that context, continue with their competition. So this should not be mistaken as a reset or a fundamental rethink of the nature of their relationship. So India, I think, will go back to, at least attempt to go back to a pre-2020 strategy of leveraging what it can get out of China to build its own economy while tamping down some of the most obvious tensions in the relationship. So again, not a fundamental reassessment, but a shift. The question for the United States, and I'll close on this, is whether somewhat reduced India-China tensions that make India a little bit less enthusiastic for its strategic partnership with us should be welcomed or should be seen as problematic, right? So India-China relations, less sharp competition, maybe makes India a little bit less eager to jump into Washington's arms, a little bit more concerned about creating problems for China, as we saw in decades past. Is that something the United States should see as problematic? And my answer is we should see subdued India-China competition as largely positive. All right, there are benefits. Less chance of war, between these two large and nuclear-armed states, greater prospects for economic growth in India, a country of over 1.4 billion people, so their future matters to global economic development, and maybe most importantly, if you're a strategist, a chance to play a longer game in which India can build itself up to be a more capable power with genuine resources to balance China over time. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So, since the end of the Second World War, and to some extent, Jonathan, you mentioned this, American grand strategy has been to prevent the rise of any peer competitor to the US-led global order. China has, in the last 3 decades approximately, sort of sought to challenge this American preeminence. The question is to both of you. Jonathan, what changes in American grand strategy would you maybe advise to the incoming Trump administration and its key officials to deal with this rise of China? And Dan, what would your response be to the same question? So I'll start with Jonathan.
Sure, and I think, Dan, something that you alluded to about the consistency here of the approach to India, I mean, the sort of enthusiasm for that approach, and we've now seen that go back almost 20 years to building the US-India relationship, and I would start by saying I think we're starting to see some of the fundamental pillars of 21st century American grand strategy emerge. And in some ways, India engagement, India enthusiasm is much more consistent than where we began, let's say, in 2000 vis-a-vis China. I mean, we're deep into the engagement era that didn't properly end really until the first Trump administration. So I think as we execute that shift in strategy, it's India that's the more fundamental, concrete geopolitical pillar of here we have a friend, a partner. I think at best we get the relationship with India that we may have imagined was possible with China back when we started the engagement era, thinking responsible stakeholder, friend of the US, security pillar, robust trade and economic relationship, and all will be well. We didn't, obviously people at that time didn't understand that that would culminate in an empowered, aggressive Communist Party of China that still believed in the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, i.e. Mao's New China. And yes, that was a big mistake. But we may get there with India where, at the very least, I think because of the economic proportions, where you're talking about a nation that will be, let's say, 6 trillion by the end of this decade, according to UBS and a couple other banks, if they'll get to be, they'll probably be under 10 trillion in the period of real adjustment of US grand strategy. So we're not yet talking about something that is actively gaining on us in a way that China was. When I wrote China's Vision of Victory, I had to start with the Chinese economy is 60% of the US GDP, and I had to revise it up twice to 70% because just in the process of publishing the book, it was gaining. We've now seen that drop back. To me, the fundamental piece of the 2020s on US strategy towards China, you have to do 2 things fundamentally. One, the economic arena is where we win or lose the long game. I think we're in the process. We are essentially winning the GDP competition, the national wealth competition, the capital markets competition. We have lost the manufacturing and strategic industries picture across the board, and that's where this administration has to focus. And I think they have to take it from the Biden era, small garden, high fence, which to me is fundamentally an ineffective way of dealing with the entire scope of Chinese grand strategy, which seeks total industrial domination in what they call a complete industrial economy. And then you add dual circulation to that, which seeks to sort of tie the world supply chains closer to China as China excises inputs to its own economy and basically anchors itself as the cornerstone of all economic activity, particularly in goods, trade, sort of manufacturing industry, et cetera. So we have to win that battle in the 2020s in order to have the fundamentals that allow us to prevail in the later decades and up to, let's say, mid-century. India, in that picture, I think, presents this real-world commercial opportunity, because at the end of the day, I mean, my view is that you win the economic competition with guidance from Washington, but with execution in the business sectors across the US $30 trillion economy. I mean, that's how you actually execute American economic power, so through our C-suites and boards. The more that India presents a commercially viable alternative in supply chains, in sort of domestic growth opportunity, all of this that allows American and allied businesses to anchor there as they exit China, the more that the China exit is actually possible. And as the China exit becomes possible in business terms, that's how you start to do strategic decoupling. And which I'm a believer in that. We have to go ahead and China being a nation that runs a $1 trillion trade surplus with the world, I mean, that's how they finance grand strategy. You cut that down, cut that down very deeply, a lot of things go away on their side, a lot of capabilities go away. But I think India has this opportunity to sort of help us step into that moment, help the US find alternatives to China, help build supply chains out of there, led by business, but then even as we facilitate, as Dan was talking about, I mean, is the new administration going to be interested in sort of co-production agreements in India? I mean, there are going to be some issues there. There have always been issues with India's own tariffs, with India's data localization, with all kinds of barriers to deepen trade. So I think if USTR we're very focused on what can we really do with India that's beneficial to US objectives of reindustrialization and supply chain security and manufacturing, while at the same time helping us to find real potential market alternatives to China. That could be very fruitful. And in the meantime, the defense trade, I mean, the fact that we have this shared concern, and I think unfortunately there might be a lot of agreement between me and Dan today, but I can also play my own devil's advocate on a couple of these things if we need to. I think the Russia factor is going to be a huge problem for us in India relations. But we have the China problem. We both have it, and we know it. And it's a much more acute problem for India in many ways than it is for the United States because of the border. In the original China-India 1962 border war, the Chinese believed in their official internal documents that India was using the border to destroy the broader relationship. And at the same time, they believed that once they had taught India a lesson, quote, on the border by attacking India, that then their friendship would flourish. So you're talking about a place that I wouldn't hold my breath for China, the Chinese Communist Party getting a realistic appraisal of how other states see their security. And in the meantime, we're going to have to deal with their military buildup across the Indo-Pacific and their buildup on the border. And I think what the US can do to contribute to that, the more that we can help India on lethality in the Himalayas, just be sure that that's an arena in which they are not at a disadvantage. That's going to open up much more strategic options in the Indo-Pacific and help India be a better partner to us at virtually, I think, no real strategic risk there to ourselves.
Dr. Markey?
Well, there is a lot of agreement, but if we're going to try to play up some differences, I guess I have questions. I have questions about sort of our expectations for India. I think that's ultimately where the core issue lies. You get no disagreement with me about the nature of the sort of broad geopolitical challenge posed by China, the threat that it poses, and the extent to which India and the United States in certain ways see that threat similarly. So there we're on the same page. The question is whether India will mobilize its own domestic resources and tie itself to the global economy in ways that can build itself rapidly enough to actually grapple with that enormous and growing challenge. And that's where the concerns lie, because India's priorities, including under the Modi government, have been sort of make in India, which in itself is not a bad thing, but it requires a kind of an earth-moving, society-altering scale of change within India to actually realize the economic dreams that it encompasses, right? And that means everything from infrastructure to human capital, public health to education and so on, right? And we're not seeing that. We're not seeing it. We're seeing some of it. We're just not seeing it at the pace that would have to happen to get us to the place where India actually fills in the gaps and solves certain strategic problems that we are likely to face with respect to China in the relative near term. And so there I would say, because I have these concerns, my emphasis continues to be on a kind of not a India will solve the problems for us or our relationship with India is the solution, but it's got to be like a much bigger set of partners, but also a reliance on traditional allies and an investment, a continued investment in them as a core part of American power and of the advantages that we enjoy internationally. And so I'd hate to see a retreat from that. That would be a concern in terms of our grand strategy going forward over the next 4 years, a retreat from our allies. And frankly, I was even surprised. I mentioned before that the Biden administration put a surprising amount of emphasis on India. I had expected that the Biden administration would put a surprising amount of emphasis, or a lot of emphasis, on traditional alliances and less so on partners like India. Now I wonder where we're going to go, but we need both. We need both.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I mean, I think if you look at the general world economy, and the bulk of the global GDP and national wealth is still in the U.S. alliance system. So NATO alone is 50% of global GDP, 60% of equity markets are probably more now, probably a lot more now actually, and fixed income markets, et cetera. So adding India to that picture, I think, on one hand, that's right. I mean, the U.S. to lead a general grand strategy that is counter-China, counter-Russia-China axis, these sorts of things that I think are just the realities of where we are. We're also going to need, in addition to the economic power of the alliance system and America on its own, a growth center. And a growth center that can engage, I think, and help create the case for other emerging markets as we get into an ex-China world. And if you think about a lot of business strategies over the last couple decades, it's really North America, Europe, and then China, and then some emerging markets, which often get balled into the sort of Asia picture, but it's mostly about China. That's going to be gone for a lot of companies now. And, we'll see that coming, I promise you that. And then the question is, how do we start to create economic opportunities? And I think India presents a fundamental sort of engine in that picture of emerging markets that's potentially very interesting, to the U.S., to our allies, as we start to look for other forms of growth and global engagement. But yeah, fundamentally, I mean, it's the alliance system is still where the bulk of the economic and military power is going to be.
So I think spend about 30 minutes talking about all the positives, potentials in the India-US, and how India can play a role in the US-China peer competition. So let me be the devil's advocate, since neither of you have taken up the bait as yet. Yes, India has tremendous potential. We have known it for at least a few decades that we are working, and many in the city have known it or sort of believed in it, and most Indians believe in it for the last 77 years. And yet, India is not yet where Indians would want it, or any of India's partners would like it to be on the economic front, defense, security, strategic. So if I was to ask you, both of you, the US may want India to do certain things. The US may want India to build its economy, hit the US-India $500 billion, become the 10 trillion economy India wants to by 2047. But there are challenges, domestic and international. The India-China border agreement may ease some of India's temporary concerns. India's long-standing relationship with Russia causes certain concerns in the United States and in other parts of the world. It will inhibit the extent to which the two countries can work together on the defense and tech arena. India's own strategic worldview prefers a multipolar world order, or a world order where India plays an equal role. India doesn't like joining camps or choosing sides. And finally, India's concern with China is primarily continental, not maritime, even though I'm sure all three of us will agree that it needs to focus on So, thrown all these things at you, in some and I guess my question is, what challenges do you see for the incoming Trump administration and the India-US relationship in this transition and the first few months of the administration? Will the pinpricks, whether it's tariffs, domestic issues, the Russia, factor, divert the attention of the administration from the focus on the India-US relationship? And will India's traditional preference for focusing within, cause challenges? So what do you see, or what would you like to, I wouldn't say warn, but in some ways warn the incoming administration to bear in mind when it comes to India-US relationship?
If I could jump in on this,
Sure.
I guess I don't have a lot of concerns. We asked about the first weeks and months. I actually think that India is pretty well positioned over the first few weeks and months. I think that they have a sense of confidence and a sense that they have personal and professional relationships with the incoming team that will enable them to have the right meetings, have the right conversations, and at the very least, deflect attention from the more potential irritants in the relationship, and maybe at the most, enable India to be an initial winner in the sweepstakes of who can kind of have the ear of the president and who can maybe benefit from some of the changes, and we'll see how they play out in terms of US policy, say, on Russia, right? So that has been a point of irritation that the Biden administration has tried to manage. That may be less of a point of irritation depending on how this administration moves forward. But I did want to pick up on one of the really important points that I would say is sort of a longer term, bigger picture set of challenges that you alluded to, which is this multipolar world business, okay? So, Indian Minister of External Affairs, Jaishankar, will frequently say something along the lines of India seeks a multipolar Asia in a multipolar world. And by that, he's saying China shouldn't be the big dog or the only big dog in Asia. And beyond that, we, India, have ambitions for a world of many different competing powers. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the United States very much on board with point one. Yes, multipolar Asia. There ought to be a number of competing challengers in Asia to the extent that China can find that as a means, something that's balancing China within Asia. That certainly suits American purposes, and it always has, and that will continue to be the case. But a multipolar world, it's not just American firsters who have concerns and have at least kind of built into their thinking about the world a set of assumptions of American primacy or American hegemony, or at the very least have built in a sense, and I think that's sort of pervasive in this question of competition with China, that the world is kind of increasingly bipolar in terms of its global structure, and that in terms of the way the United States needs to consider other countries, you're either leaning us or leaning China. And so why is India sometimes called something like a swing state? It's because in the back of your mind, you're thinking about the world in bipolar terms. But multipolar, a world in which the United States has to accept that there are actually competing great powers beyond China that will inherently balance our ability to push forward a preferred agenda or to kind of map out the world in relatively simple terms. No, that's not comfortable for us. And that will continue to be a point of some, I'd say, continuing at least discomfort and maybe disagreement with India going forward. And I don't think that's the kind of thing India will play up in its initial conversations with the Trump administration as it attempts to avoid sort of false steps in the first few months and weeks.
Yeah, I'd like to address that as well. And I'm going to answer that by, if we go back to the Russia-China No Limits Partnership document from February of 2022, if I remember this correctly, there's a line in there where it says the Chinese side recognizes Russia's ambition to have a multipolar world. And it reminded me a lot of sort of the way we look at the Taiwan situation, where we recognize that you believe this. That's what the Chinese were saying to the Russians. We recognize that you believe this. They were not saying we share that aspiration because China does not want a multipolar world. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation does not end in a multipolar world. It ends in economic and military primacy for the People's Republic of China. So I think, and I had a conversation with the Indian Foreign Ministry about this during my PhD at one point to sort of say, look, I know you believe this, but what happens at the end of that road is this multipolar thing, which may make sense in Brazil, it may make sense in Moscow, it may make sense to some extent in New Delhi. That's not the competition that we're actually in. And I think India risks the entirety of its rise. To your point about India is not yet where India wants to be. I think they risk their entire rise to what they want to be if they hang on to those ideas. And the reason is, if we go back all the way where, in the Kennedy administration, they were deeply courting India, trying to, during the border war, how can we bring India onto our side? How can we do this? a lot of the problems there had to do with our embrace of Pakistan. But nonetheless, it was ultimately India wound up in the Treaty of Friendship with the Soviet Union, and I think partly because of that lost maybe 2 generations of development, whereas China swung to the US side, and without access, again, to the American market, to American capital and technology, there wouldn't have been a rise of China. I mean, it was an agrarian nation that became an industrial and technological superpower essentially through its access to the American market. So I think we do have to communicate on some of the philosophical, strategic issues here, which is what kind of world are we going to live in if we hang on to really the contents of non-alignment in the Cold War era and what that actually delivered for India ultimately, versus what it delivered for China, which played that game very well to our disadvantage. So I don't love that outcome. But I think if India really wants to get to those places where it desires to be, with a $10 trillion economy, with a very substantive growth rate, with all of that potential that I think we can see in the abstract when we disregard some of the real problems in terms of state-owned enterprises and tariffs and intellectual property protections, and some problems of which are very analogous to our issues with China. We have the opportunity to get this right, but both sides have to do it. I think the U.S., the early days are going to be, I would say, opportunity, mostly in terms of anchoring in these fundamentals of the fact that India, if all goes well, is a fundamental element of American 21st century strategy. And this is a robust thing. I mean, this is, our alliances, I think, have a lot of, are very heartfelt. It's not just practical. It's not just realpolitik. I mean, it's a good community to be a part of. It's necessary for each other as long as everybody pays their dues, which I do agree with. But bottom line, that's the community to be a part of. And then for India, I mean, I wrote something for the Indian Institute of Land Warfare Studies years ago about, the way that India swings will determine potentially the fate of the free world. I mean, if they really do swing to the side, if they can let go of some of the ideas that they have, which on one hand, you can crudely reduce non-alignment to the idea that India wanted positive relations with the Soviet Union and the United States, at least for a time. And I think where we are, Russia's chosen a side. That's going to go very badly for them. And I don't think India should choose that side. I think they have much more to gain through swinging more deliberately to the democracies, and I think it will build deeper trust where we do start to see those issues emerge, which will be the kind of thing, on the most important weapons systems, the most important forms of tech collaboration, technology transfer. Those issues will become much bigger sticking points, I think, if they are trying to play all sides or winding up without a philosophical resolution to their relationship with Moscow. I mean, that's going to be a huge sticking point for the U.S. I think in the years going forward, given that Moscow has chosen sides with China for now.
So I'll ask one more question, but just before that, letting the audience know that after this question, I'll open up to the audience. So just a small comment. Yes, I agree with both of you, but what I would say is something which sometimes American strategists and policymakers forget that other countries have their own strategic calculus. And so whether or not it's good for that country, the country may prefer to go down a path that it decides to go down for its own reasons. And so yes, we may want India to do something, but India may stick to the policy India does. And so the three of us...
If I could say, I mean, that's precisely the point I'm trying to make, which is, we may have a worldview that is more either unipolar, hegemonic, or bipolar at the very least. India doesn't. The fact that we want them to go a different way doesn't, India will go its way, as they have very clearly said to us in print. And so we need to take that seriously. And India has its preferences. Now, for those to change in the way that you're describing would require a fundamental political and political cultural shift in terms of perspective on the world, and a very different ambition from India's current leadership than anything of the sort we're seeing, or anything that is contained within the sort of ideological elements that undergird that worldview. So lots would have to change in order for that to shift, and I'm not seeing it. Now, we could imagine it, but I'm not seeing it.
No, I agree.
And at the same time, I think there are inherent risks to maintaining that view
Agreed.
in the time
Agreed.
Of opportunity for
Yeah,
India.
absolutely. So, quick question before I turn it over to the audience. 4 years ago, we had the violent clashes in Galwan. Let's say from around 2012 onwards, there have been periodic skirmishes between India and China on the border in different parts of the border. Both of you, have written on this. So my question would be, do you and none of us has a crystal ball, but in case either of you do you anticipate the possibility that in the coming months, despite the border agreement, there will be a skirmish? And what I'd like to ask you, do you see the skirmish on the land border, or do you see China upping the ante in the maritime domain, since its relationship with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with Maldives, with Pakistan, has grown deeper. There's security cooperation. There are ports. You can call Hambantota and Gwadar. So where do you see China putting the pressure? Do you see China, letting India be and not putting any pressure on India for the next few months? Dan, and then Jonathan.
Sure. Short answer would be, gazing into my crystal ball, I foresee at least several months and possibly through almost a year of relative calm. I mean, I hate to make predictions because they're always wrong, but the reason for that is I think that it's been a considered and now long-standing expectation from Beijing that they would try to smooth things over with India along the border. And the reason for that is because, I think I said before, diminishing returns to that type of sharp pressure along the border. And as I also said before, this is not a reconsideration of pressuring India strategically or a pullback on sort of the general Chinese attitudes about competition, including in India's neighborhood. All that continues. But I think it's time for a breather. I think that's consistent with China's kind of broader global approach. And I think that they are going to really want to feel out this new administration in Washington. And I think they feel that they have their hands full with that. And so they don't want to have an unnecessary complicating factor, which is also difficult to predict. And anything that they might do in the way that you've described would be difficult to predict. Now, if we get a year out, other things become possible, certainly, and especially back to the land border. I think China has, unfortunately, a lot of asymmetrical advantages with respect to that. I think there's always the possibility that you would see other things contributing, including, say, succession scenario with the Dalai Lama, other things that would kind of tip us into a short-term political and then military crisis. Those things are all possible. And then the needling of Indian interests in places like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, that will all continue. And so how India responds to each one of those things, and the ante will be upped over time. So this isn't going away, but I would say if I had to guess, we're on a bit of a pause.
Jonathan?
Right. I think if anything, China's trying to stabilize what they can in order to focus on what's coming with the U.S. I mean, Trade War II, I think, is going to keep them pretty well occupied. Their own focus on Taiwan, their own military buildup, which is principally focused on the first island chain. I think as much as we can talk about India having the traditional fear of a two-front war with Pakistan and China, I mean, China also has that concern and has going back to the early Cold War of the potential for a two-front problem in the Pacific and in the Indian Himalayas, which is part of why India has such prominence in their strategic worldview going all the way back to the beginning. But I imagine they're going to have their hands full with the United States, and at the same time, the way that they have played that border for the since the very beginning is one in which they can create crises, have pressure, not necessarily control those crises, and I think none of that is gone in any real way, even if we've had this disengagement moment and the sort of new Xi-Modi meeting, these sorts of things. Bottom line, they will continue to use that border at a time of their choosing. So I think it's still in the picture. And as to the maritime side, it depends on how serious things get in the Western Pacific. But India still has the problem of enormous infrastructure and investment and trade saturation across the entirety of the Indian Ocean rim. And in a world in which China did not have pressure in the West Pacific, they would be flowing military forces across that. And I think they still intend to do that in the long-term future. So India is going to have to focus on a very broad strategic environment here. And the US, the more Indian Ocean focused we can be in addition to our Western Pacific strategy, I think the more we're dealing with China's real long-term game. And that's an area where US and India can collaborate to put counter pressure on China. And we should be really focused on that.
Thank you. Right up front, first row.
Thank you. This has been fascinating.
If you could introduce yourself also.
I'm sorry?
Introduce yourself, please.
Donald Camp, retired Foreign Service officer who served in India and China. This has been very interesting. I think I'm on Team Aparna. India is going to do what it wants to do. It has a very solid view of its security interests. But I was thinking about what China could do if it wanted to sort of preempt US attempts to make India a more dependable, not ally, but partner. If I were looking from Beijing, I would think, what does India really want? It wants a settlement of the border, and it wants a seat in the Security Council. China is the impediment to both. A settlement of the border, it's always seemed to me, is simple, the status quo. China claims Arunachal Pradesh. It withdrew from Arunachal Pradesh after the war, and it's been India's for 60 years. If they agreed to a border settlement, that relieves the major issue between the two countries. And if they drop their opposition to India in the Security Council, well, that makes all 5 members of the Security Council, permanent members, on record as supporting an Indian seat. I'm just asking, my question really is, could China find a way to preempt us in India?
And also, please ask questions to Aparna as well. She's probably the most knowledgeable person. Just to address the border question, because obviously that's the original 1960 Zhou Enlai proposal. He goes to Delhi and he says, look, we're going to take the Aksai Chin, the western sector, and we'll grant you the eastern sector, and India wouldn't have it. I mean, it was, I think if anything, sort of horrifying to them that the proposition would be, we're going to take your territory in exchange for giving you your territory. So I'm not sure that's changed. And that idea was a non-starter then, and I imagine it's unappetizing now. And then in addition, I mean, it was the Soviets that proposed also to Mao and Zhou Enlai and everybody back then, why don't you just give them the land they ask for and we can all be friends and it'll be Russia and China and India. And that was actually a major driver of the Sino-Soviet split. So in that moment, I mean, I remember the archival document where they're yelling at each other and the record is something like the Chinese ambassador essentially was cursing at the Soviets. And so I'm not sure we've gone past that moment. I mean, these are very real, I think, not only territorial issues, but the very idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, I think, was the driving force in the China-India border war at the time, the idea that China would not be trampled on. So for them to make that move today when they couldn't then would probably be an evolution beyond what I would expect. And then for India, the thought that this is our territory and you claim it, that's illegitimate. I'm not sure that's changed either. A grand bargain, I wouldn't bet on it, but I see your point. That's always probably been the nature of how that gets resolved. And at the same time, that opens up, how does that change many of the other issues in the picture, such as, I mean, Indian Ocean is going to become one of the biggest issues there is. I remember a head of a Chinese think tank that focused on India told me during my PhD, the Indian Ocean is going to be the most important region in the world for China for the next 40 years because we will depend on it for the next 40 years. So the Belt and Road, I mean, it's no accident that its locus in some ways is that very region, and that very region is the sort of epicenter of the trade between Eurasia, Africa, Indo-Pacific, all of it. So I think in many ways the border, even in the original border war, was a sort of simulacra for some of the very deep issues in the relationship their dislike of India's relations, not only with the US, but with both superpowers, the sort of gravity that India had in what was then called the Afro-Asian sphere and today is called the Global South, and then the very fact of the new China in Chinese ideological and sort of CCP thinking. So I tend to see those factors as stable, and that grand bargain, which couldn't happen then, I would not bet on it happening now.
I mean, I just add on to that I don't see the, from the way I see it, China seeks to keep India down. The relationship with Pakistan has less to do with Pakistan. It has more to keep India occupied on one part of its border and divert almost as many or more troops on the India-Pakistan border than the India-China border. So if there's a border agreement with India-China, by default, there's also less tension India has on the Pakistan border because there is no two-front threat. India can focus on its economic potential, its military potential. It can rise. What advantage does China have by a rising India, by an India which actually builds its economy and becomes a potential rival? So there is no upside to India's rise. They're and then the second part, I agree with Jonathan. I mean, countries do not give up territories, especially countries which are either post-colonial states like India, or countries which believe that imperialist powers came in and prevented their rise and took their, and forced borders on them, China. And so ideological reasons and identity issues prevent countries from giving up territories. We're still in a Westphalian world centuries later. I don't see that changing. Dan, did you have any comment?
Yeah, because I like the question, and I think there is an inherent puzzle here, right? A clever and patient China would have done a lot of things differently over the past 20 years, and including its relationship with India. Because it's not actually immediately concerned about India's rise so much as I think it's concerned about India's partnership with the United States, or at least it ought to be concerned about India's partnership with the United States. And so this question of why not drive a wedge if you're clever, or if you're thinking in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South China Sea, why pick fights all over the place when your economy is growing, all these countries are basically becoming part of your sphere, you're basically winning without fighting. Why would you then go ahead and start fighting? Doesn't make sense. Has more to do with the nature of what this China is and how I think its kind of intentions and ambitions and aggression have outgrown or outpaced, unhelpfully, strategically, have outpaced its ability to do all of these things at once. And so it's picked fights too early. And it's not the first rising power to do that. And I think that has redounded to its disadvantage. I think this move with India was ill-considered. I think China could have had India still kind of in a comfortable spot, building up an asymmetrical advantage along its border in the Himalayas with respect to India, and not pick a border fight. Why tip India into a position where its animosity toward China has peaked over the past few years? Why not allow it to go along naively expecting that it could manage its relationship with China? Why do any of that? It doesn't make sense. And yet that's what China has done. Wolf warrior diplomacy also doesn't make sense. So China does some things that aren't as strategically shrewd as it might, and this is one of them.
Could I add one piece to that, though? Because I think it's also worth noting that there was the entirety of the 1950s when Bandung and Panchsheel and 2,000 years of brotherhood. And back when I was at Oxford, the central question of my PhD thesis was, how do you go from Bandung to border war? I mean, how do you go from two nations, that Indian independence in 1947, founding of the PRC in 1949, they immediately declare themselves brothers of 2,000 years, Zhou Enlai, Nehru, very, sort of emotional speeches and sort of powerful diplomacy, and then immediately it collapses within 10 years into war. And so I think that has been tried in a sense, and the real enduring picture is, I would say most of this is about that very concept that still animates the People's Republic of China, the new China, the Great Rejuvenation. And I remember meeting a a Chinese India specialist who told me that we can control, 可以控制印度, like we can control it. And it's just that mindset. I mean, why would China turn on America in the way it has when we gave them economic ascendancy? I mean, there are all these questions that I think are the fundamentals of our geopolitics, and India is going through the same brunt of it that we are.
The last row, yeah.
Hello, I'm Satvik, work for ASG. One of my questions is that you had mentioned that the different things that the U.S. and China had gained on. The U.S. still had the advantage over GDP capital markets, whereas China had the advantage over manufacturing and strategic trade. But when we're looking from what are the things that India really seeks to build in the next few decades, it is that very strategic trade and manufacturing things that those assets that China has. If you look at India's steel plants, almost all their furnaces are from China. And when it comes for India to build its own capabilities, what are the things that the U.S. can really offer to actually get India to shift its mindset on these things, or to go the extra mile on what things that the U.S. wants if the U.S. does not have those assets or the technologies or the capabilities that India really seeks that China has?
Let me take any other question. I'd like to combine a group of questions and then the panelists can. Tom, right in front.
I'm Tom Duesterberg, Hudson. I hesitate to do this, but going back to the land border again, one of the ways that China can exploit its own advantages is all the water in South Asia comes from the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, and China's aggressively building dams and trying to control access to that water, which they've effectively done for Southeast Asia already. But now they're looking at the major rivers going into India. Is that sort of something that is a long-term impediment to improving, stabilizing the border, even though it's not exactly on the land border? But could you comment on that, whether that's a problem or something that can just be managed?
Okay, so then let's take both of these.
Answer.
I'll start with the water question of Tom. Actually, sort of for India, the water issue is a big issue. It has to do sort of with both its neighbors, Pakistan and China. With Pakistan, India is the upper riparian, and so Pakistan normally has. But at least the two countries have an Indus Water Treaty, which they signed in 1960, and to date they haven't. Both have abided by that agreement. It's the World Bank manages it. Between India and China, sort of, there have been conversations because for India, the rivers from China come both into Kashmir, but also on India's eastern side. Brahmaputra or Sangpo comes in. And there have been conversations, and India's concerns have been that China has been building a lot of these run-of-the-river dams, the smaller dams, not larger dams. And those dams have, basically at some stage, they will prevent water from entering into India. The conversations haven't gone very far, but the conversations are there. Now, they are not at the top of the list as the border issue would be, or disengagement and all of those, or the Dalai Lama and Tibetan issue would be. But the water issue is there at the top of the agenda for India, China, and will remain as the glaciers melt in the Himalayas, as there's less water which will come into India from China, and as China deliberately tries to ensure that less water goes into, that it holds on to more water, all of these will play a role. I don't know when it will actually, when the issue will come to a head, but it will come in the next, I would say, decade. That's the best answer I can give you. On the economic front, I will throw it to Jonathan.
Sure. And in terms of, if I recall, your question is essentially how can U.S. India engage on certain manufacturing items when the U.S. itself doesn't supply those items So how can we help India rise? I mean, I think first of all, the general picture here is for the world to, China as workshop of the world didn't work out. I mean, it creates supply chain insecurities that will, I think, be disastrous in an era of China as the primary adversary and everything else. So I think we're going to have to solve that as a system, as an ex-China system. The question really becomes how do you, it's not that the US can supply some component part that China is currently supplying. It's that, China has cornered the market on so many items. And what I found, I was doing a lot of C-suite consulting during Trade War I. And it was very interesting because the strategy that people would ultimately move to in that period was, look, we have manufacturing facilities in different parts of the world that are used to supply global markets, essentially according to what's economically viable. Suddenly it became regionalized. It became, how do you get your China factory out of the US equation? How did you move it that way? How do you move things to Mexico or Europe or Southeast Asia, et cetera? And that's just one phase, because what everybody figured out is no matter how well they did that, they couldn't get component parts anywhere but China. And we are still in that moment. I went through the notes on the proposed rulemaking from USTR on the Biden EV tariffs, and that actually it's a whole bunch of industries. I mean, there are ports, talking about their cranes, there are different medical device companies talking about their components. Basically, everyone's saying we can't get components anywhere. We can't get certain finished products anywhere. It's a list of where China has cornered the market. And I think the bottom line, to answer your question in a broader way, I think the next battle for trade is not supply chain diversification in terms of from supply to demand source, that kind of reconfiguration that many companies have already done. It's really how do you fix the components, just down the entire list. How do you get finished goods, inputs, and components ex-China in, let's say, the immediate future of 2 to 3 years? I mean, how do you solve as much of that problem as you can? And I think I know it sounds crazy, but it's also going to be a necessity. There's some that we can buy, that we can stockpile to do that sort of thing. But I think generally speaking, that's the problem that the international trading system has to solve for geopolitical purposes. So where does India fit into that? Where does the US fit into that? Where does Southeast Asia fit into it? It's going to be, I think, a new manufacturing and trading system where different countries will have different advantages that others don't. I mean, for instance, India's capability, your question was about steel, which I think is much more contentious, given that the US does want to have a steel industry, and therefore that's already a sticking point with Section 232 and the rest in the India trade. But, if we take a different example, like pharmaceutical components and APIs, I mean, the fact that India makes those and is potentially a very secure and friendly partner in that in the long run, that's an advantage that they'll have. Textiles, India can do that. We don't need necessarily textiles from China if you can move a lot of that to other places. So I think it's going to be a general sort of rip and replace in the international trading system, with the bottlenecks being components and inputs. And, we're going to be solving that all together, hopefully.
Dan, any?
Yeah, just two quick points. I mean, to answer the question about US-India cooperation, I mean, part of the reason why the United States and India have focused on things like ISET, where you're talking about not steel, but critical and emerging technologies, is precisely because those are the areas, A, where India sees a huge advantage from working with us, and B, where, in a sense, they're right, we have advantages. And if strategically it's in our interest to work with India, then we'd be inclined to do things for India and with India that we won't want to do with China and with others. So that's why that makes sense. But it doesn't solve India's manufacturing problem. And it doesn't solve its growth problem, and it doesn't solve its jobs problem, right? So we are not necessarily India's best solution to a lot of the things that most plague India's economy. So that's a problem. On just the water issue, to the extent that I've seen some studies on this, the only addition I would make is just that you're right, it's something that India worries about to some extent in the abstract. It's a little bit different from the Pakistan concern about India. What's hard to see is how China's current dam building projects would actually restrict water such that it would actually parch India. So that's that would be the real threat, and we're not seeing that yet. Now, maybe some mega dam projects that have been talked about for a long time that haven't gotten off the ground could conceivably get there, but you'd really have to see a lot more. And so I'm, I guess, ultimately in the same place you are, where it's something that will be a lingering concern simply because of geography. and because of ultimately scarce resources. But some of the places where the Brahmaputra flows actually have quite a lot of water. So water per se is not quite the thing that you are worried about. And so that's a different situation than what, say, the Pakistanis face with respect to water scarcity and slow flows and things like that, and variable rainfall and things, melting of Himalayan range, sources of water from there. And that's the last point, would be these same studies suggest that the principal thing that India and China need to work on is the monitoring of flows, of water flows. If they could exchange data, that would be hugely valuable. So it's kind of that concern about flooding and variable irrigation, things like that. Those are the greater concerns.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel, both Jonathan and Dan, for coming today, and thank all of you for coming here. Thank you very much.